later on and will be there like for a really, really long time if you want to catch up. And I would also like to invite you to participate in a discussion via social media, via the accounts of Europa Nova Germany, on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. And there's one last thing I'd like to mention. We have the option for questions via Slido. You can find the link to that tool, to that platform, in the YouTube discussion, but also on the Zoom webinar. So, more about logistics. I think there's nothing else to say. I hope so I didn't forget anything. So let's start with our wonderful panelists today, talking about the European Green Deal and what actually also climate security means for the European Union. I like to start with the wonderful Gabriele Köhler. She's based in Germany, and she is involved in so many different ecofeminist projects. For example, she's also a board member of the Board of Trustees of Women Engaged for a Common Future. And she has just been part of the review committee writing a report together with the European Environmental Bureau called Agenda Transformative European Green Deal. So thank you so much, Gabriele, for joining us today. Our second wonderful speaker is Louise van Schaik. She's based in the Netherlands, and she's head of the unit on EU and global affairs at Klingendale, like I said, in the Netherlands. And recently she published parts of the World Climate and Security Report with special focus on the military. And our last but not least wonderful speaker is Thomas Pellerin-Garlin. He is based in France, and he is the director of the Jacques Delors Energy Center. And he would like to bring in the topic on climate alliances and innovations today. So I'm really looking forward to that. And he has recently published, for example, a paper on Make Transatlantic Corporations Great Again. So I'm really, really looking forward to our discussion. And like I said, please feel free to put your questions via the platform Slido. So before we start with the input of our panelists, I would like to ask our fellows, our participants, to use Slido to type in 3 keywords what they think climate security in the European context is. So I'm just heading to my tablet to monitor what kind of keywords we have here. Okay. So again, to the fellows and the participants, what do you think is climate security in the European context? Feel free to type in, 3 keywords. 1 is also enough. If you're not sure, so far no keywords. I would really encourage our audience to add a few. Okay, so of course there's the Green Deal, which is a super, super important framework for the European Union. Any more keywords coming in? So there's another keyword that's really interesting, linking climate security also to economic security. We have here green energy throughout. That's also true in the European context and often forgotten. Catalyst, conflict. So I can really see like now keywords are coming in. Please feel free also to, during our event, to continue doing so, because by the end, we will come back to these keywords again. Human security, global cooperation. Thank you so much for taking the courage and writing our keywords into the chat. So let's start with our panelists in the first question. So I would like to know, Gabriele, from you, which topics do you think are often overlooked when we talk about the EU Green Deal?
First of all, thank you very much, Miriam, and thank you very much, organizers, for this interesting opportunity. Before I go into the European deal, and I have a lot to say on its design, I think I was looking at what this conference overall is about, and this juxtaposition of European security and defense. And I think what we really need to, I'm sure everyone here knows, but what we need to remind ourselves is these stark inequalities on the planet, inequities and inequalities. The Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN published a report yesterday that shows that 3 billion people have less than $5.50 a day per person to live on, and 2 billion people face food insecurity. The hunger rates are going up as a combination of all the conflicts, COVID, and climate crisis. And at the same time, we have this obscene wealth. On the other hand, we see people privately flying into space and having the funding to privately, commercially fund that, while people are, on these minimalist incomes, and even facing hunger, which is the most acute form of poverty. At the same time, as again, everyone in this room is aware, but just to put it on the plate, we have the climate, the climate, it's more than a crisis. We have a climate catastrophe. We have floods, droughts. At the moment, we have these huge fires. We have glaciers melting. And again, here we have huge inequalities. In the European Union, we use about 9 metric tons of CO2 per person every year. In the low-income countries, it's only 1 ton per person. So huge inequality. And so if we're looking at defense, if we're looking at security, if we're looking at human security, it's really about equalizing, not necessarily erasing the carbon footprint, but actually bringing down our carbon footprint, but raising incomes and enabling people to have access to decent jobs, to have access to resources, water, land, fisheries, and to also make sure that everyone on this planet has social protection. You might not know in this particular group that 70% of the world's population do not have any kind of social assurance, social protection coverage, which would help them in times of acute income poverty, having an accident, becoming sick, having other kinds of crises that they face. So these enormous inequalities, I think, are what drives the insecurity issue. Maybe I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gabriele, for directly pointing out the global inequalities we are facing or not facing, depending on who you ask. And I would like to ask Louise to jump in now and also to comment on Gabriele's first statement and also what you think is often overlooked when we talk about climate security and also when we talk about the EU Green Deal.
Yes, thank you. And also thank you for the invitation and the interest in this topic. I mean, it's great. Climate security was already in the real Munich Security Conference with separate panels. And we also notice at Klingendael and also in the context of the Planetary Security Initiative, which is a project on climate security nexus, that there is this huge interest with young people, young professionals, and we can also clearly understand why, because that's actually the first remark I wanted to make, is that I totally agree with Gabriele Guller's comments that climate security also aggravates current inequalities in the world and makes that worse. But what I think is also a topic that is overlooked, and that's maybe a bit the contrary, is that it's also something that affects us. It's not only a far away and a future issue. It's also something that happens in the West. Calls, for instance, for military assistance with extreme weather events are on the rise. And look, for instance, what happened just now in Canada. Look what happened to this little place, Lytton, where it was first nearly 50 degrees and then it was completely burned down. So I think it's important to realize that climate security is relevant for all parts of the world. Although in the West we tend to still talk about the topic as something, you know, affecting the Sahel, the Horn of Africa, the Middle East, Southeast Asia. And this is perhaps something which is not entirely correct. And what we could also see, for instance, with the pandemic, we kind of hold, but we also saw looting in the streets. When the hurricane Irma struck the Caribbean, also the Dutch-French island of Sint Maarten was completely devastated, and the Dutch Navy did not only have to go there to provide assistance and disaster relief, but also simply to keep law and order, because that was really necessary on the island. And I guess that's also where I can make the link with the European Green Deal. In Europe, the climate change agenda is, for understandable reasons, really presented as a growth agenda, as an economic opportunity. If we are the first ones to decarbonize in a situation where an energy transition has to take place, we can have an economic benefit from that later on. And we are smart. It's also something that we morally have to do, reduce emissions to address the climate crisis, but it's also presented as an economic opportunity. And that perhaps undermines a little bit that we should also realize that it's also a risk, a security risk, a risk to stability, and a threat. I'll leave it here.
Thank you so much, Louise. Pointing out actually that we should not always look, for example, into the global south, but also really look on the European continent, and also you mentioned the overseas departments of some European countries. So thank you so much for bringing in that perspective as well. So Thomas, I would also like to ask you what you think from your perspective is often overlooked when we talk about this topic.
Well, I would like to put the emphasis on two topics that are linked to the geopolitical impacts of climate mitigation policies. The first topic is shifting geopolitical alliances. Think of one key alliance of the last 80 years, the alliance between, on the one hand, the EU and the US, and Saudi Arabia on the other hand. This very weird alliance between with a country, Saudi Arabia, with which we share little history, very few values when it comes to gender equality or democracy or whatever, and even our geopolitical interests do differ quite a lot. So this alliance was started during World War II, and it was built on Western dependence on Arabic oil, clearly, and this outweighed everything else that has happened over the last 80 years. This alliance survived everything from the creation of the State of Israel to the 9/11 attacks or to the assassination of Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi. But why should we remain allied with Saudi Arabia when we will be far less reliant on oil? And when will this year be? Is it 2025, 2030, 2035? We don't know. That's just an example of a shift in alliances. Some countries that are our close allies de facto today may not remain our allies in the future because our interests are changing. This also means that there are countries in the world with whom we should connect more and have closer relations, because also our interest in the energy transition will make them more important. Those are especially countries that have a lot of access to critical minerals that are needed in the digital and green transition, like lithium, like cobalt. So you can think of countries like Chile, countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo, all those countries becoming increasingly important as the green and digital transition progresses. The second topic that I think is insufficiently discussed now is the technological challenge. So to avoid having a climate disaster, we really need to do a lot of stuff. But part of the stuff that we need is also to develop and deploy clean technologies. China and the US clearly want to achieve technological dominance on clean technologies. And they want to achieve something that is similar to what we already see, which is the US and Chinese technological dominance on digital technologies. And the fact that we Europeans today, this afternoon, we need to use a US software in order to be able to have an online conference. It's just one example that we have literally in front of our eyes today to understand what technological dominance by a foreign country, so non-European country, means. The difference, however, with clean technology is that we Europeans today have everything that we need to become clean technology leaders. That's important for us to be autonomous, to have more strategic autonomy, but it is also important for the world in order to reduce the number of areas of our life that can suffer from a too direct confrontation between the US and China. So having the EU as a clean technology leader is also important to avoid clean technology becoming a new area of US-Chinese confrontation.
Thank you so much, Thomas. Also, like really pointing out that it's also when we talk about climate security, it's also about like thinking about alliance in the past, but also alliance in the present, and also future alliance, and what we actually, like with we, I mean the European Union, what the European Union actually wants to achieve with those alliances. So before we start in the second round of questions, I would like to leave a little bit space for our fellows to ask questions regarding your comments on what is often overlooked in the European Green Deal, and maybe also I would like to encourage them to ask questions of other related topics regarding climate security risks. So I'm taking now back my tablet and looking at the Slido questions. I think they are in the app now. Let me check. Again, using technology, Thomas. I'm not sure where Slido is based, but I guess it might be also like in technology. So waiting for the questions from our participants coming in regarding your first statements. There's a first question. How can the EU as a whole respond to countries who blatantly ignore global climate goals? Oh, wow, that's a tough question. So, Luis, would you like to start?
Would you repeat the question? So what are the climate goals?
How can the EU as a whole respond to countries who ignore global climate goals?
Yeah. So what is really interesting is that tomorrow the European Commission in Brussels will present its Fit for 55 package. And in that package is expected a proposal for a carbon border adjustment measure. So for the first time, the EU is going to use its trade power to have a kind of import levy on products and energy from other countries for which in the European Union industry would pay a carbon price to produce them. And that would be normally the same price placed at the border. And I think that's going to be a very strong signal. Already it was announced that the Commission was coming with the proposal, and that already caused a stir. Also debates on whether, that would provoke a trade war potentially, because other countries in this world, including the US, see it also in a way as a protectionist measure. But I think it makes also very visible that the EU has a carbon price on carbon intensive industry and on fossil energy electricity production. And others have ambitions to reduce emissions, such as, for instance, the US and China, but don't actually have the carbon price or the policy in place to make it a reality. So, and then in addition, the EU has instruments for climate and energy diplomacy. For instance, also the commitment now to spend 30% of the EU's budget climate related, so also the external action funding. The NDC instrument, a new instrument for EU external action. So I think there is going to be huge opportunities, and the EU is already doing things, but more things. The lending programs of the EU, for instance, by the European investment banks, a lot of things will have this decarbonization objective in mind. And also already a lot of the dialogues the EU undertakes with, well, everybody in this world basically include climate change on the agenda. So in that respect, I think the EU is already doing a lot, and it's going to do even more. And the CBAM, yeah, that's going to be really the exciting thing to look at. to watch. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much also for giving us something to read and to follow. You mentioned it in the beginning. Thank you so much, Louise. I have like 2 more questions, and I would like to address one of the questions to Gabriele and the other one to Thomas. So Gabriele, here's another question in the chat. Is the German supply chain law, the Lieferkettengesetz, enough to mitigate negative environmental and social impacts of decarbonization?
Thank you. That's a great question. And before I go into that one, I want to turn this other question, the preceding question, how can the EU as a whole respond to countries who blatantly ignore global climate goals? I think we have to first of all look at the EU ignoring climate goals, because the EU is not on track to achieve the climate goals. And we're using our carbon footprint as the European Union is 4 to 5-fold that of other countries. We're vastly exceeding our entitlement, if you will, in the planetary resources. So I think we first of all have to ask ourselves, and that brings me to the second, to your second question on global value chains. The German supply chain law, due diligence law, is far too weak. It was hollowed out by industry. There were long discussions with industrial groups, and the government unfortunately caved into their interests. So we have a very weak due diligence law. It falls way behind even the EU due diligence law design, which is now under discussion in Brussels. So it will not address the CO2 goals. It will not address the social justice goals. And as I mentioned before, we have these huge disparities. And I wasn't saying that we only have disparities between the North and the South. We have them in our own countries. 60% of the population, 20% of the population live with less than, live under the relative poverty line. 20% of children in Germany, as a very rich country, where this absolutely should never happen, 20% of children in Germany live in poverty, in income poverty and in social exclusion type poverty. So supply chain law is not enough. And coming back to my earlier point about what are the root causes of insecurities, it's actually this unfettered capitalist system, which does not allow for social welfare kind of thinking, for eco-social welfare states, for a different way of organizing the economy. And that applies to the European deal as well, I would venture to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gabriele. And also thank you so much for all the interesting questions now coming in. I would just like continue because I think it's really important for us that our audience can address their questions. So Thomas, there's a question for you. You said that today's alliances, for example, with Saudi Arabia could shift, but shouldn't Europe work with such countries on a Green Deal transition beyond oil?
So my point was really on the kind of widespread geopolitical alliance that one has. So you can definitely work with Saudi Arabia on the green transition. To be honest, they don't really need money. They have quite a lot of funds that they can use themselves to develop clean solutions, and they have all the sun that one needs in order to be able to power a developed economy. So the big energy transition challenge for Saudi Arabia is really just about political will. They have the money, they have the natural resources to become one of the cleanest countries on earth. So obviously, it makes sense for the European Union to work with Saudi Arabia on that. I was more referring to, let's say, wider geopolitical issues where we know that our governments are being silent on, let's say, what's happening in Yemen, on the death penalty being applied in Saudi Arabia, on the treatment of political opponents, all this kind of stuff, where we have the majority, if not the entirety of the national governments that are particularly silent because they don't want to hurt the importance of EU-Saudi relations when it comes to oil. With oil becoming less important, that changes the equation, and it may lead national governments to make a decision on, let's say, resetting the relationship between Saudi Arabia on the one hand and EU countries on the other.
Thank you, Thomas, for explaining more in detail what you actually meant with shifting alliances. We have a question, and I think that could be addressed to Louise and Gabriele. What are your thoughts on using nuclear as a nuclear energy, I think, as a green solution, which some other countries are doing? So the question is, yeah, what are your thoughts on using nuclear energy as a green solution? Louise, would you like to go first?
Yeah, I don't have a super strong opinion on this, but in general, I think with the issue with nuclear is that it still has waste. It's still a relatively expensive energy source with also long investment lead times. So it's still, let's say, multinational and big investors driven energy. Whereas with other renewable energy sources, solar, wind, even perhaps green hydrogen less, but hydropower, maybe tidal, geothermal. Geothermal, you also need investments, but you can have more decentralized, different energy systems that eventually, I mean, the sun shines for nothing and the wind blows for nothing, if it shines, if it blows. But I'm not, like strictly against nuclear, but I think in many circumstances it's maybe not the ideal solution. So other, let's say, energy sources are preferred, and we see so much progress now, and also the price of other renewables coming down so quickly. Let's say the economic argument also is not so valid anymore, is my impression. Although it's always a bit, it's not so transparent. What are the real costs of nuclear energy? So it's a bit guessing.
Liz, thank you for sharing. Gabriele, what are your thoughts on nuclear energy as green energy?
On nuclear in a second, I just wanted to pick up on something that Thomas said earlier about technology and how we're all using Zoom and other US-based technologies. I don't know if people here are aware, there's actually a global public good called Freifunk München, which is the exact same facility to do conferencing, networking, chat calls, and whatever. It's free, it's in the public domain, it's and we're just not using it. Why are we not using it? Why are we not, aware of it? It's called Freifunk. I'll type it in the chat after. Freifunk, free broadcasting Munich, FFM. Anyway, but on nuclear, I'm 68 generation, so I'm totally opposed against nuclear energy because of the waste issue, as Louise pointed out, but also because of the investment issue, as Louise also pointed out. I think what we need is decentral forms of renewable energy that are run by citizens or by people living in places. There's plenty of potential on rooftops, in fields, etc., in our own country. And I would like to add in this discussion on renewables that we also have to again look at our global footprint. There are reports now from Chile where the Mapuche indigenous people are being crowded out of their indigenous lands because we as the global north are building huge solar, what do you call them, these fields where you have all the solar panels built. And so that's not the option. It has to be really locally based, and we have to also reduce our per person energy use. But anyway, no to nuclear from my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriele. Thomas, you like to jump in, or you would prefer taking the next question?
No, I'm happy to take this one. I think it's an important one because, well, two things, I guess. First, we really need to understand the scale of the change that is needed if we want to avoid a climate disaster. This scale, in terms of cuts to greenhouse gas emissions, the only moment in recent history where we had a cut that was aligned with climate neutrality was the 2020 COVID pandemic. Part of the thing we need to do is to electrify a lot of stuff. Cars, trucks to some extent, some industrial production. That, according to the International Energy Agency, for instance, means that we need to multiply by 4 the amount of renewable we put on the grid every single year. And this is something that's going to be bloody hard. And to me, that's the first thing that we need to understand. The second thing is to always compare any option, whether it's coal or nuclear or onshore wind or whatever, with the alternative. If you just look at one option and you just focus on the negative elements, you won't do anything. When it comes, so we can, for instance, when we compare the issue of nuclear with wind, so let me first say that because of the need to electrify, it's about increasing electricity production. So increasing renewables is going to happen everywhere in the world. Increasing nuclear will happen in some countries that decide to do so, and will not happen in others who, as a result of democratic free will, have chosen to phase out nuclear, like Germany or Italy or Austria, to name those. But so you have the climate impact, and when it comes to the climate impact, nuclear is CO2-free emission source. If you look at the life cycle analysis of nuclear, the emissions of nuclear are comparable to the emissions of wind power, but it emits less than solar panels. So if you, for instance, replace nuclear with solar panels, you actually increase carbon emissions by a little bit because of the way solar panels are being produced. So from the climate impact, there's a big case for both wind and nuclear, and to a lesser extent, solar panels. Then you have a second issue, which is the issue of critical minerals. Obviously, we don't want to solve the climate problem while creating a massive dependence on critical minerals that are not renewable and that are also creating local pollution in China, in Congo, in all other places. And here, one of the benefits of nuclear compared to most renewables is that it is less reliant on specific raw materials, critical minerals like silicon, for instance, even if it's more intensive in other critical minerals like chrome, for instance. And finally, there is the issue of the waste. But here also we need to face the reality that regardless of what we do with nuclear today, we will need to deal with the nuclear waste problem because we have already created too much nuclear waste. And a lot of this nuclear waste has nothing to do with energy. Historically, the number one responsible is the military. And once you have built a nuclear bomb, you have two ways to dismantle it. Either you just bomb someplace, or you dismantle it and you need to deal with the nuclear waste. And there's also the nuclear waste coming from the healthcare sector because of radiotherapy that is used to treat many kinds of cancers. And so regardless of what we do with nuclear, we will still have to deal with a massive amount of nuclear waste. So with all things being taken into account, what we are going to see at the global level is a rise of nuclear. We have countries like China, like the US, that are extremely in favor of the development of nuclear energy, and they see nuclear energy as being something to promote, while they're also promoting renewables. So they're doing both at the same time. For us in Europe, it's an extremely divisive issue that is linked also to, let's say, the nightmares that European peoples have. And so extremely, in a very legitimate manner, countries like Germany, Austria, Italy decide not to choose for nuclear. Belgium and Spain also getting out. So for those countries, we need to build a 100% renewable energy system, which is doable, but comes with a lot of challenges. While for other countries like the Czech Republic, Hungary, Sweden, Poland, or France, or Bulgaria, there is a choice for nuclear, which also makes the transition to climate neutrality a bit easier, just a bit, not a lot, just a bit, because it reduces a bit the amount of renewables you need to put on the grid every single year.
Thank you so much, Thomas. We have so many more questions here on Slido, and I would like to ask them, but I would also like to take a break here from the questions. We have here around 4 questions. So because I would also like to talk with you a little bit more about the projects and the work you're doing at the moment, because I think it's also really interesting for our audience to understand your different fields, political fields, and also the means and tools we actually have from as political actors shaping the European Union Green Deal. So, Louise, in the beginning, I mentioned the report you recently published, especially with her focus on the military and the connection between the military and green or climate security policies. So, I would like to ask you to elaborate a little bit more on that report and actually the work you have done there, and also what you had in mind, what you want to achieve with this report.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Klingenau and the Planetary Security Initiative are a consortium partner of the International Military Council on Climate and Security, and this publishes yearly a report, and now the second edition came out. Actually, the first edition was launched at the Munich Security Conference in 2019. The second edition came out, the World Climate Security Report, and our contributions focused on the one hand on the role of the EU in this space, and especially its climate and defense roadmap that it published in 2020 and is now also embraced by the EU defense ministers, but also in the Council conclusions on the external dimension of the European Green Deal. And our other part of work focused on what we call climate security practices. And on the Planetary Security website, we have an overview of what organizations or entities are really doing in the field to seek that climate change projects contribute also to peace and stability objectives, to engage in environmental peace building activities. Because while more people recognize climate change as a security risk, the amount of action going into this and projects and budgets and also the changes made to, for instance, UN peacekeeping operations and so on, that's still only gradually evolving now. And also the practice is not big enough to really being able to say what works and what doesn't. So if you, for instance, plant trees in the Sahel and thereby create livelihoods for the people who live there, is that perhaps a better option than to fund security forces or to do a program to prevent them being attracted to violent extremism because they don't see any other opportunities anymore. Huh? So how do such, let's say, green interventions, climate change projects also compare to other options in the field of conflict prevention, peace building? So these are basically the two things that we do. Perhaps a little bit more on the EU side, because it's also the topic of this panel. What I find really interesting is that the EU has made this very detailed climate and security roadmap in which they want to, for instance, they are now adding environmental advisors to EU civilian and military missions. They are integrating climate change in early warning that they have. They are considering how to reduce the carbon footprint of the military and to invest in military R&D from a green perspective. But they have a lot of actions that they have detailed out and that they're really taking on. But it's happening a bit in isolation. So there is, of course, interaction with the colleagues from DG Klima and from the other parts of the European Union. But traditionally, let's say the green movement and also the development movement are not that interested in military emissions, because on the one, they don't really see the military as a big polluter, or they don't think they will change. They don't like the military, and also they are a bit suspicious that the military would use perhaps or misuse the securitization argument of climate change to ask for extra funding, justify a new military mission in the Sahel, but to use the Sahel example again, but could be also elsewhere. And also in a lot of other countries in the world, for understandable reasons, often the military is more seen as, you know, the bad guys and not, you know, the ones that look after climate change objectives. So we also have, let's say, we have also done some work on this topic of, you know, to what extent are some of these concerns also legitimate, but also, yeah, how can we avoid that the military now becomes involved? And also, for instance, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg is very much on top of this issue, has been an environment minister in the past. So how can we avoid that they do these things in isolation and without, let's say, disconnected from, let's say, the bigger overall picture of reducing emissions and the European Green Deal effort? Yeah.
Thank you, Louise. I think, yeah, actually the military part is often overlooked, and I think it's a really, really good reading to dive into the report you have written to understand what kind of barriers, but also opportunities, but also of what kind of concerns are actually legitimate when we talk about the military and green policies. So talking about the unusual suspect and also changing alliances. So Thomas, would you like to elaborate a little bit more on the recent research and projects you have done on that topic? And would you also like to talk a little bit more about what kind of target audience you are aiming to achieve with your research and your projects?
So most of my research in the last month have been focusing on the EU, what is called in the European Union, the Fit for 55 package, which is a massive legislative push that will actually be proposed by the Commission tomorrow. So I've been working on it for more than a year now. And I was focusing specifically at the innovation challenge. And the reason is because a lot of people are focusing only on the short term. So short term for climate means 2030, and only looking really at the easy stuff. And the easy stuff being, the shift to electric cars, at the end of coal, all the stuff that are technically easy to do. And those stuff, must absolutely be done, like as soon as possible, no questions asked. But they can only take us so far. To put it a bit abruptly, existing technologies can only get us half of the way to climate neutrality. We need new clean technologies to get us to the finish line, to allow us to run the last 20 kilometers of a marathon, if I can use that metaphor. And my main concern is that when I talk about clean technology to politicians and also to civil servants, most of them have the idea that technological progress falls from the sky, as if it was some kind of God-sent, blessing or curse, depending on people's point of view. And so that's actually, pretty wrong, and it links to inaction. So if I may use another metaphor, because I'm apparently a big fan of metaphors today, politicians have the idea that innovation comes from the private sector first and foremost. They have the idea that the private sector is a roaring lion that is put in a cage made of public taxes and public regulation. And this cartoonish vision is simply wrong, especially in the energy sector. Obviously, some great business people and innovators do exist, but the vast majority of business people, especially in the energy sector, let's say, resemble more pussycats than lions when it comes to animals. Extremely fearful of change. So we need the public sector to push them. We need the public sector to transform those CEOs who are pussycats into roaring lions, because we do need the private sector to innovate a lot if we want to get to climate neutrality. How do we do that? We do that through two main public tools. The first one is public funding. The US is doing it, China is doing it, we are not. In Europe, over the last decade, we've been decreasing the amount of public money going to clean energy research, development, and demonstration. At the same moment, the US increased that. So there was an increase even under the presidency of Donald Trump. So while Donald Trump, under his presidency, the federal government in the US increased public funding for clean energy research innovation, we in Europe decreased that public funding throughout the 2010s, and it was part of the wider austerity programs that were implemented in several European countries in the early 2010s. And so that's really the first thing we need to change, absolutely. And the second element is to adopt the kind of regulation that really stimulate innovation. And even, for instance, I was talking recently with the CEO of NL, which is a big utility, a European utility historically based in Italy. And he was saying something that is very easy to understand for business people, but that politicians somehow don't get, is that if you want innovation, sometimes you need to have powerful regulation that force change. And that to me is absolutely vital. And so that's why I hope tomorrow the European Commission will propose genuinely ambitious climate innovation policies and regulation. To maybe just give one example, one such element would be to set a super ambitious target with concrete milestones that allow us to get there. So, one example would be to have by 2040, all the steel that we consume in Europe comes from green steel. So a way to produce steel that does not emit CO2. There are several options. One is direct electrification. Another one is indirect electrification through renewable hydrogen, for instance. So that would be, sending a big signal to the steel industry that they need to change everything in the way they produce steel. And you can also create what we call in the scientific literature niche markets. One such niche market could be created as of 2025, and it would be to say that, for instance, 10% of the steel that is being used to build cars needs to be coming from green steel. And that would be a way to send a clear market signal, and that would be something that researchers, innovators, clean tech investors can use and say, okay, let's transform this great idea that somebody had decades ago in a lab, and let's deploy it in real life to see if it works. And to me, that is absolutely vital. If we don't do that now, then in 2030 we will realize that we have walked the first 20 kilometers of the marathon, but we don't have enough energy to walk the last 20 kilometers of the marathon, and that would be a deep chain.
So, Thomas, you mentioned the private sector as actually also as an important actor when we talk about the EU Green Deal. Louise, you talked about the military also as an actor we should look at. And Thomas, you used the word like going into the direction we definitely like a change, a transformative. We need transformative tools. We need a system change actually in the European Union, and that's where I would like Gabriele to jump in to talk a little bit more about the report we were working on together, which is actually having the title "A Gender Transformative European Green Deal." So, Gabriele, would you like to talk with us a little bit more about the report and the chapters you have worked on together, and also what you would like the European decision makers to actually take out of this report?
Thank you, Miriam. First of all, as Thomas was pointing out, thank you for that. It's so important to put emphasis on publicly funded research. Picking up from a different field, the COVID vaccine development was very much funded publicly, but now the returns are being harvested privately. And we have vaccine apartheid. We have the EU, thanks to Germany, not agreeing to a TRIPS waiver, although the very rapid and wonderful development of the vaccines against the COVID-19 pandemic were developed with public monies and pushed with public monies and public support. So the role of the government in provisioning of public goods, education, health, and others is vital, and I think it's important to stress that. And what the thrust of the report on a green, just, climate just, gender just, ecofeminist type of critique of the European Green Deal relates to what Louise was saying about the silos in the European Union. We have a wonderful gender strategy, and then we have the Green Deal. They don't talk to each other, and gender doesn't even feature in the Green Deal text, except very marginally somewhere at the beginning. So what we as feminists think needs to happen if we really want a transformative deal, and I'll say a bit about transformative in a minute, is to have the whole economic rationale to change. What we need is an economy or a society that values care work, both unpaid care work in the home for one's family, for one's relatives, for one's community, and paid care work in the health sector, in other sectors, to make that the core, because that's really what a well-being economy would be about, what a socially just economy would be about. And if care were at the center, instead of profits, instead of commercial criteria, instead of economic growth, which is very much at the center of the European Green Deal, it's very much based on sort of a competitive vision of what the EU should be about, instead of a transformative, socially just vision. If we made care the center and then built all the components, including economic development in the EU, but a transformative form of development, we would have a very different trajectory of what the EU is about. We would have different thinking about energy poverty and how to address it, about mobility poverty and how to address it. So we have a very different time poverty, the gender care gap, the gender lifetimes earnings gaps, etc. We have a very different approach to the whole idea of what is the European Union trying to do. We would integrate gender into green and into social justice. And so the idea of that report, which by the way, there will be, I think, an exciting press conference on Friday, which you might want to listen into. What that report is about is having an eco-feminist, care-centered, well-being-centered approach to the European Union's vision for 2030. And very importantly, I think we also need to link that to the global picture about what the UN is trying to push, which with its agenda for sustainable development, with a transformative vision, the Paris Agreement on climate change. And these overarching umbrellas really need to inform what the European Union is doing. As you probably all know, there are 17 Sustainable Development Goals. They are about social justice, they're about economic justice, and with the Paris Agreement, they're also about climate justice, limiting global warming, global heating. And I think we need to bring sort of this European Green Deal under this more transformative global vision of the United Nations. I hope you all know that at the moment, the UN has its 2-week high-level political forum on the Sustainable Development Goals. All of the sessions are actually on YouTube. You can watch them on United Nations TV. And there's a sort of a struggle for coming to a good vision, a proper vision, a socially just, ecologically just vision on what transformation would be, with member states of the United Nations, talking to civil society, often having very conflicting views of what a transformative agenda would be like. But I think when we speak about the European Green Deal, we need to also put it into that bigger context. And actually the Green Deal text at the beginning does refer to the UN Sustainable Development Strategy, but sort of gets lost in the rest of the thinking.
Thank you, Gabriele, for letting us know what the report is actually about and also what the intentions are to conduct such a report. So now we talked a little bit about the work you're doing at the moment, and I would love to go back to the questions we have in the chat. So far we have 4 questions now. And I would like to start with a question for Louise. How can we change the EU and member states' current narrative from win-win green growth towards more realistic climate-sensitive European societies?
Yeah, I can understand, let's say, the reasoning. So to present the European Green Deal as an economic opportunity, but I guess there is still the risk that, for instance, with the Fit for 55 package that will be presented, we will see probably a higher price for transport, for heating of your house, for companies in Europe to use energy. So there is still the risk, you know, that they will only see these higher costs and not, let's say, that is for the bigger benefit. And also I tend to agree with Gabriele that we don't discuss much the carbon footprint of our activities and sustainable production and consumption, which is also one of the SDGs that Europe never talks about. So let's say the bigger lifestyle question, and also how this issue is related to the current way that we have organized our economy, and the way we live and consume. And I'm honest, I also have a gas heated house and a car. I haven't flown a lot because of the COVID, and I try also not to do it so much in the future, but of course I've taken airplanes. So it's these kinds of issues that we have to address. And I don't want to mention even the garbage that I have in my house. The amount of carton or plastics, just the whole consumption patterns that we have. And we talk about this a lot, and we talk a lot about circular economy, resource efficiency, recycling, but the steps that we take and the progress we make is just too little. And part of that has also to do with innovation. So I very much agree also with Thomas that we also sometimes still lack the technologies, but part of that is of course also, let's say, the honest story about the environmental costs of how we live, consume, that needs to be addressed. And the risk is a bit that if you now present a kind of very positive picture in order to sell this in the short term, and especially if the member states have Brussels do this, that in 10-15 years it will come back and haunt you, and Brussels will be blamed for let's say the negative sides, and maybe not enough recognized for the positive side of the transformation that they now try to catalyze.
Yeah, that's definitely true. And yeah, thank you also for sharing like the personal aspect when we talk about European societies, because I think sometimes we also forget that we are also part as individuals of the European society and what we can actually do and change. So Thomas, there's a question for you. What are, in your view, the geopolitical implications of shifting from climate mitigation measurements to resilience and adaptation?
Before answering this question, I wanted to add the part of the answer on the issue of green growth and to use an example linked to the mobility sector. I think one way to overcome this debate on green growth is first to understand that GDP is a very, very bad measurement of happiness and welfare in a developed society like the EU society. I don't want to do the whole story of the GDP, but if you talk to any, any smart economist will tell you that GDP is just, irrelevant if you want to use that as a measure of happiness and well-being in a developed society. So we just need to move away from that metric because the GDP is not a relevant one. However, we can definitely make sure that a climate neutral society is better and economically more prosperous. So we have, better material condition, and this can be done especially by focusing on the quality of the assets that we have, and this is different from the GDP. So if we use the example of mobility, so mobility system today emits greenhouse gases for sure, but beyond this, we spend on average 2 hours a day in transport, 2 hours a day. That's a lot of time that could be dedicated, to friends and family and sports and art and whatever you want. And on top of that, this mobility system contributes to air pollution that kills 400,000 Europeans every single year. That's the entire population of a big city like Bordeaux or Bilbao that dies every single year. That's that's similar to COVID death if you look at it annually. And we can get rid of this air pollution, and we can do that through two main tools. One is what we call in the academic literature, so energy sufficiency, So you can think about cities like Pontevedra, for instance, in Galicia in Spain, that has installed since the 90s a pedestrian-only city center. So that's super good for well-being. That's also super good for the climate. That's also super good to avoid noise, for instance, and for people who need access to mobility that are not living in cities. You do have, electric cars that are cleaner, that are produce less noise. So you also have a lot of, and that, by the way, also have a longer life and cost less to use them. The engine is more reliable, so you have a lot of positive stuff. So you can improve the material conditions also by doing a climate transition. To answer briefly on the geopolitical implications of shifting from climate mitigation to resilience and adaptation, first, I don't think we need to shift from climate mitigation to resilience and adaptation. We need to do both at the same time. If we stop doing climate mitigation, it's going to be eventually the end of humankind if we stop doing climate mitigation measures. We do climate mitigation precisely to avoid this worst case scenario. That is what we call in climate science the Venice syndrome, but also to avoid the most important impacts of climate change. And so that's absolutely super important to do both at the same time. One reason also why we need to do a lot of climate mitigation is because the kind of adaptation you need to do will be different depending on the intensity of climate change. If you have, for instance, a 2-degree global warming, you can still have human beings living in Malaysia and Indonesia, but they need to adapt. If you have a global warming of 4 degrees, that's almost impossible to live in this country. Because you would have, most of the days would be days where there would be, on average, what we call a deadly heat wave. So that's a moment where the temperature outside, so the outdoor temperature is higher than the temperature of the human body, so 37, 38 Celsius degrees. And humidity is so intense that the human body biologically cannot lose temperature by sweating. Currently, in places like Venezuela, like Nigeria or Indonesia, the number of days where you have this phenomenon is in a few days a year or tens of days a year on average. If we are in a 4-degree global warming, that's 250 days a year, where you would have this level of temperature that will just make literally human life impossible in those specific locations. And Venezuela, Nigeria, Indonesia, those are countries with quite a lot of human beings living there. So you need to have extremely serious climate mitigation to know which kind of adaptation you need to do, and whether your adaptation will be about protecting people, or whether it also needs to be sometimes, and that's going to be a tough sell politically, but nonetheless retreating. There are some places on Earth where human life needs to retreat because it won't be able to adapt. And so here we're not talking about what's going to happen in the next years, but in the next decades for sure. And that will create a lot of problems. A lot of people are thinking about small islands, but small islands, almost by definition, there's a small population living there. But here we're talking about Nigeria and Indonesia when it comes to heat wave. We're talking about Bangladesh when it comes to coastal flooding. And we need to prepare for this and hopefully find a way to organize that in a peaceful manner. Because if we don't, we know what's going to happen.
Thank you, Thomas. There are still more questions here, so I'm just going to ask them. Gabriele, that's a question for you. What are options to connect agendas? For example, the Women, Peace and Security agenda, the Youth, Peace and Security agenda, better with the climate security agenda on a European level?
Thank you. I'm a very strong believer in civil society. And what I see both in Europe and also at the global level is that there are these different civil society groups, umbrella groups that bring together in each country civil society around one issue. And we have this challenge, a bit like the pillars of the EU departments, that we have in civil society also, that many wonderful, very energetic, very forceful groups of young people, for instance, the Fridays for Future is one example, who are organized around one main themes. So Fridays for Future, basically around climate justice, or the social democratic movements around social justice. And what we need to do is to bring these different one issue or few issue, non-governmental organizations, civil society organizations, to bring them together. What I see at the European level, I don't see so much of that happening. At the United Nations level, I mentioned the high-level political forum. What I see there is that the different thematic groups, the women's major group as one constituency, the youth group, the trade union group, that they're coming together, also in regional subgroups, and they're actually seeing how they can organize around what actually are common issues. So the feminists are now very strong on issues such as debt cancellation, because they say if the government is not going to cancel its debt that it's accumulated, especially now in the recent past, because of the COVID responses, COVID pandemic responses in terms of social transfers. If governments do go into austerity, it will harm women more than men. And so these two constituencies are coming together. The climate activist Thomas mentioned the issue of people having to leave their countries. In the Pacific, already in the Paris conference, we saw how there's this coalition of the willing of countries particularly threatened by global sea rise, coming together and actually forcing France and other more powerful players to really push forward this Paris agreement with the 1.5 degree warming cap. And so I think, on the European level as well as on the global level, I think the different issue concerned groups need to come together. So the feminists with the climate groups, the social justice groups with the climate justice groups, and others. But I don't know if that answers your question.
Thank you so much, Gabriele, to point out the connections between different agendas, and also I think that's also kind of the tone we have today in that discussion, that climate policies cannot be regarded in a silo, like they're so connected to so many different aspects of our lives and so many different political fields. So I think that's also where this question is coming from. So I would like to give our audience again the opportunity to raise more questions regarding what have already been said. Maybe also there are some questions. Yes, Thomas, sorry.
Yeah, I just wanted to add an example on the issue of connecting agendas. So one concrete example could be on access to renewable electricity, especially in places where there is no electricity connection yet. Here, from an economic perspective, renewable is the best option. It's cheaper to just deploy solar panels in a village rather than building a big power plant and building a electricity grid that does not exist. The way you need to connect this, and this is mostly valid for Western Africa and rural India, but I guess it's also valid for other countries and other places in the world. One thing is to first build the renewable electricity generation on site in order to really meet the needs of the local population. Part of that will be irrigation, which is a way to promote agricultural productivity, fight hunger, increase economic well-being, also adapt to climate change, at least in areas where climate change does not have extreme consequences. And you can also try to meet the needs also of providing electricity for some kind of very small-scale industry. So for instance, in a village, you could have people that can use the electricity to use a machine in order to be able to produce locally, those kind of nests and tents that you can use to protect yourself from mosquitoes in countries where malaria is a big problem, just to provide a very concrete example. But that's important to think on the project from a holistic point of view. It's not just providing a bit of electricity, it's providing an energy service that is useful to the local community and that focuses not on providing access to TV, which can create problems, especially of internal migration, but that's another topic, I guess. But electricity that can support the local economic development of a specific community. Then you can add a democratic layer on this, because you can make sure that the person who owns this production can be, for instance, the entire village. And if you do that, then in many areas where there is already some local democracy experience from the past and from the present, you can have a democratically managed, very, very small electricity generation site, which is a way for the people in that area to get accustomed, to democracy, essentially, because you develop democratic practices that are linked to like super practical stuff about managing the electricity system, and that gives you, skills and know-how and practices in order to find a democratic compromise on any other kind of topic beyond just energy. So I just wanted to show this because you can we can have a very broad and macro debates, and that's always super useful. But you can also boil this down to very, very concrete projects that can really try to be good for climate mitigation, access to energy, economic development, and also democracy.
Thank you, Thomas, for jumping in. Actually, we got like a lot of more questions now, and I would like to ask them before I will address my final question to you. So, which one can I pick? So there's one, I guess, Luis, you can definitely answer pretty well. So, because we talked about it before, should the EU impose sanctions on member states who fail to work towards new targets? So it's not about countries like outside of the European Union, now it's about the member states. What kind of sanctions, or should the EU impose sanctions on their own member states?
Well, in all honesty, I think we already have that. So for the 2020 targets, that is already divided between this emission trading scheme for heavy industry, which has a direct effect for all the installations in EU member states. And if they don't make their targets and don't buy credits from others, they have to pay a direct fine. And the other share is an effort sharing target for each member state for 2020. And then now for 2030, there is already one in place that makes up for minus 40% in 2030, but the Fit for 55 package is willing to up that to minus 55%. And if member states fail to comply with their effort sharing targets, the European Commission can bring them in front of the European Court of Justice and start an infringement by starting an infringement procedure against them. And what is now new tomorrow is that the EU is also going to propose a kind of ETS emissions trading scheme for energy used in built environments, so in houses and other buildings, and the transport sector. So there you will also get a kind of direct EU policy that will increase the price of fossil heating, or cooling, perhaps air conditioning, and fossil energy, gasoline used for cars and other transport modes. So then it is not so much anymore if there will member states that don't adhere to it anymore, but it's rather that all the member states will have to deal with it. And now, of course, they have to kind of accept these proposals in the EU Council. So the next step is that all the member states are going to look at these proposals, and then you need a qualified majority. So not a single country can block it, but a minority can block it. And the European Parliament, it needs to be a simple majority eventually. Initially a higher majority, but then a simple majority. So in that respect, the Fit for 55 package and also the climate law that the EU has adopted provides so much, in a way, certainty that the EU is really going to do this. And that also makes the EU really different. I would like to emphasize that from other parts in this world, which maybe make a statement in the UN General Assembly, like China did, that they will reduce by 2060 and have their emissions down by 2030. But what are the policies that they're actually going to be put in place? And also, what do we do if they change these policies? Because if you have an EU policy in place, it's also not so easy to change it anymore. In that respect, the EU is almost like this oil tanker. If it shifts course, it will also go into that direction. it's not so flexible to change it anymore if we don't make it. So, and the instruments as they are designed now will make it because of the way they are designed for part. It's not for all sectors. There are still sectors where there will be national targets. And for instance, for agriculture, there is still a lot of steps to be made. I also agree with Thomas that we still need a lot of more funding and innovation. By the way, also in this military innovation, because also a lot of innovations we have in societies like the internet were the result of public innovation spending in the military sector. And I think if you can have a CO2 neutral air fighter or a Navy ship, then you will solve the whole issue of emissions in transport. But yeah, so this is quite significant what's happening now. And it's also quite compelling. So it's not like with, for instance, the rule of law issue that if countries don't stick to it, that the EU has to find ways to pick it up. There is already procedures in place. Of course, they can still ignore the fines of the infringement procedure and so on, but still, it's difficult. And a lot of it is directly applying in the member states.
Yes, it's definitely also essential then to know what is already out there and what kind of structures and procedures the EU actually has to follow up then on sanctions and so on. So there's another question I would like to address to Thomas, because you have talked before about the private sector, and this question is, how can the EU influence global enterprises to be more responsible in the fight for climate security?
That's a big topic. Well, many things. One thing that is currently undergoing is the adoption of the details of what is called the Sustainable Finance Taxonomy, which is one way to really influence investors and therefore global corporations. The original philosophy of that taxonomy was to say, okay, we're just going to label as green investments that we know are really aligned with what we need to get to climate neutrality by 2050, essentially. But then there was a mobilization of sectorial lobbies of several governments that were pushing for stuff to label as green elements that clearly are not green. And given this conference happening in Munich, I must say that the German federal government played a very, very bad role there, pushing for the inclusion of gas, natural gas, fossil gas being considered as a green as a green investment. So there's one element here that is linked to the Sustainable Finance Taxonomy, because this will allow all investors, whether big or small, to understand clearly, to have a trusted label that says whether that company is making this percentage of its investment in green investment, how many percentage are done in brown investments, so investments that do significant harm to the environment, and what is the percentage of investments that are done in gray, so stuff that are neither good nor bad for the environment, like for instance, investment in healthcare or education, just to name those. And so that already would be a big step if we have a credible, a science-based taxonomy, which we do not have yet because of the influence of specific lobbies and the lack of let's say willingness of some people in national government to make the general interest prevail over the interest of specific companies. But that's a very common phenomenon, including in today's society. So that would be definitely one way. Maybe another tool that can be extremely impactful is again through regulation. If you have a very, very tough regulation, a very clear regulation that protects the environment, global companies are gonna respect it anyway because they need to access the EU market. So first, you need to have that regulation. Second, you need to have also the proper implementation measure and control in order to make sure that there is as they would call that in Brussels, a level playing field between all the actors. One example here that has been quite successful globally is the EU energy efficiency labeling. So it's this color code with the letters from A to G and the colors from green to red. That shows you whether a flat, a house, a refrigerator, a washing machine is energy efficient or not. This has existed in the EU for more than a decade now, and a lot of countries in the world have adopted a similar mechanism. And that has been a big driver for change in the global manufacturing sector. And this has pushed companies that are producing fridges, for instance, to make sure that their next fridge is going to be far more energy efficient, because they know that thanks to this EU regulation, having an efficient fridge will just allow them to have the green A, and they will therefore provide their new product a competitive advantage compared to other products. So I'm just using that as a specific example, but here again, we could go in many sectors and to see which kind of regulation actually push global companies to let's say act for climate, not because they are kind-hearted, and we're talking about multinational companies in the end, but just because we made the framework in a way that what is good for climate is also what is good for their business, for their bottom line. And so we have done some collinear change, and so businesses now do stuff that are good for climate because it happens also to be good for their bottom line. But this, does not come from, doesn't fall from the sky. It comes from policy work, civil society mobilization, concrete regulations, and legislation that are passed.
Thank you, Thomas, for taking that question from the audience. So there's one last question from the audience I'd like to address, and then I'd like to ask you for a final statement before we close our panel. So Gabriele, there's the question: how can we ensure that climate security includes everyone and doesn't leave people behind? So the question is about how can we make sure that already marginalized groups are included and also seen when it comes to climate security policies in the EU context.
I think, there's two sides to it. One is that civil society has to be given voice, has to be heard, so the concerns have to be brought into the discussion. But it's not just about giving voice, it's actually about taking voice. And it's very important that civil society claims the space and says, we have a right to be here, we have a right to climate justice, we have a right to redistribution. In the EU, there are these internet-based consultations, which are interesting as an instrument, but I've participated in several and I've never actually seen the discussions fill into the EU policy formulation. So I think we have to be very clear that if we don't actually voice our concerns in the streets also in very visible forms and move away, it's important to have internet-based discussions. It's very important to publish papers, but if we really want to re-regulate global capitalism, it has to actually come from the streets. So, the question of leave no one behind, for me, it's always a question, who says that someone is left behind, and who pushes people behind, and how can all those persons, communities, groups that are left behind by this unfettered form of globalization, how can they claim how, we have to claim our spaces and intercede in these discussions. I wanted to point to one process that I think is extremely important for today's discussion, which is the negotiations around a binding treaty for business and human rights, which would actually be this regulation, maybe not exactly in the form that Thomas is thinking, but it would be a regulation on climate justice, environmental issues, ecological issues, as well as social justice, labor standards, and human rights. That would be a level playing field in the EU jargon for all companies in the world if it were adopted. And that's a process at the UN that I think is very important.
Thank you so much, Gabriele, and thank you so much to the participants and fellows who have asked the questions via Slido. There's still some more questions, but we are running out of time. But I think it really shows that climate security and also the EU Green Deal is a topic people are interested in and want to learn more about it and also want to share their knowledge on that topic. So my final question for your final statement is the question, if you would have today have the opportunity to make a wish, what would that be regarding the EU Green Deal? Please just keep it short, like maybe 30 seconds. So if you would have a wish today, what would it be regarding the EU Green Deal? Louise, do you like to start?
Yeah, for me it would be that there would also be an emission reduction target for the military, what they do at home, but also abroad, and preferably actually something which would be agreed upon in Glasgow, so at the international level, and not only at the European or NATO level, but maybe that's still a bridge too far at this stage. Thank you for the invitation again. Thank you for your interest. I wanted to say to the young people, I think there's also plenty of opportunities now in the field of climate security with more international organizations. The UN has its climate security mechanism. So please also follow us on Planetary Security Initiative. We sometimes can also publish blogs from external authors. So you can also contribute if you're interested. I'll stop here. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Louise. Thomas, what would be your wish for today, for the future?
Well, my wish is always, kind of always the same. I like the sentence. I would like to paraphrase an Italian philosopher named Antonio Gramsci. And he said that we need to articulate the pessimism of the intellect with the optimism of the will. And to me, we need to hold both sides of the equation. As researchers, we have a duty to humankind to really understand, what's happening. And if someone reads a climate science article and is not pessimistic, then he or she has failed to understand what that article is saying. So we really need the pessimism of the intellect to understand what is at stake here. But if we just have the pessimism of the intellect, that won't lead to action. Fear is rarely, let's say, an emotion that leads to positive action. So we need to have the second side of the equation, which is the optimism of the will. And I'm actually pretty optimistic about our capacity to avoid a climate disaster. So sometimes in the end, I'm just thinking that whatever happens is going to be fair, in the sense that if we fail to avoid a climate disaster, it will be because of our collective fault. And that also means that we have the capacity not to fail. We genuinely have the capacity to build a world that will be better than the world we had in the 1990s or even 10 years ago. And this world can be a climate neutral world. So yeah, I would like to end on a call for action. Because this optimism of the will, to transform that into positive action, you need, people doing stuff, learning, joining groups, acting as citizens, as workers, as investors, etc.
Thank you, Thomas. So I can hear there definitely a call to collective action. Gabriele, what would be your wish for, your wish of today, but for the future?
I have two wishes. One is that the $1.2 trillion that is spent every year on the military are drastically reduced. I would want in that connection to flip the NATO's ask for 2% of GNP to be spent on the military, and only 0.7% by developed countries being spent on development cooperation, that to be flipped at least. So those are my wishes on the military side. I think we have to be very careful to not glamorize what the military is doing. It's at the root cause of many of the conflicts, many of the deaths on this planet. And then specifically on the European Union, I think I would hope that we get an ecofeminist understanding and rationale centering on care, centering on well-being into the European Green Deal. As a footnote, for me, this word deal is very revealing, because deal is always about sort of you know, like a business interest coming together. I think it really has to be putting people at the center, putting gender justice at the center, including everyone, and not being profit driven. So we don't really want a deal. We want a fair eco-social contract that works for all. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Like, I personally learned a lot being the moderator today of this panel. I think also our audience got a really good impression of different topics and also different approaches when we talk about the EU Green Deal. And I also would like to thank our technical team in the back, because without them it wouldn't have been possible to do our conference. And yeah, I also would like to make a short announcement that we have our next panel at 3 p.m. on cybersecurity. And I would really like to invite you to join via YouTube on the live stream. So thank you so much for taking part in our conference, and hopefully see you for our next conference. Have a great afternoon. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.
Bye-bye.